The first-class cabin of Flight 172 was a sanctuary for the wealthy, where power meant privilege. Or so Jonathan Carter believed. Arrogant and entitled, he mocked the quiet, imposing man beside him, unaware that some men don't need to prove their power. Because the man in the hoodie, he owns the airline. And before this flight lands, Jonathan will face a reckoning that money can't stop. How do you survive a fall when there's no parachute? Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us, where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. The first-class cabin of Flight 172 was a sanctuary of quiet luxury, where the wealthy sipped champagne, whispered deals, and sank into their plush leather seats, cocooned from the world below. The soft glow of overhead lights reflected off crystal glasses, and the occasional flick of a newspaper signaled a leisurely indifference to time. But for Jonathan Carter, time had just slowed to a crawl. He stood at the entrance to row 3, his expensive leather shoes pressing into the rich carpeting, his jaw tightening as he took in the seating arrangement. This has to be a mistake. His fiancée, Veronica Hayes, let out an audible sigh, her manicured fingers clutching the handle of her designer handbag. She flicked her caramel-highlighted hair over her shoulder, her sharp green eyes scanning the cabin before locking onto the source of their distress. A man, no, a presence, was already seated beside them. He was massive, built like a heavyweight fighter, yet carrying himself with a stillness that made him seem larger than his physical form. His black hoodie sat open, revealing a broad chest and powerful arms that barely fit within the confines of the first-class seat. Dark jeans rested over thick legs, and his face, partially shadowed by the brim of his hoodie, was unreadable. His mere existence made Jonathan uncomfortable. Jonathan's lip curled in distaste. There's no way we're sitting next to that. A flight attendant, Sophie, turned toward them, her professional smile unwavering but her tone firm. Sir, these are your assigned seats. Veronica scoffed, eyes flicking between Sophie and the man in the hoodie. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice, but making sure it was still loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. We paid for first-class luxury, not to be squeezed next to... She hesitated, looking at Shaq again before finishing. Someone like him. The man still hadn't moved. No flicker of reaction, no shift in posture. Only those dark, unreadable eyes, watching, calculating, waiting. Then, he did move, just slightly. His head turned, slowly, locking onto Jonathan with the measured stillness of a predator, deciding whether its prey was worth the effort. Jonathan stiffened, his mouth suddenly dry. Sophie, maintaining her composure, straightened. Mr. Carter, Ms. Hayes, first class accommodates all passengers who have a ticket. If you'd prefer a different seating arrangement, I can check availability in economy. The subtle sting in her words was not lost on Jonathan. His jaw tightened. Absolutely not. A chuckle came from somewhere behind them, a low, amused sound. A few murmurs followed. Jonathan felt the heat of eyes on him. His own tactics, passive humiliation, superiority, were being turned against him. He hated it. Veronica exhaled sharply, rolling her eyes as she reluctantly slid into her seat. Jonathan did the same, stiffly lowering himself into the unacceptable reality of sharing space with this man. The seatbelt sign chimed. The cabin lights dimmed slightly in preparation for takeoff. Jonathan leaned toward Veronica, voice hushed but sharp. This flight better be short. The man beside him turned his head, just slightly. His voice was a low rumble, steady and unshaken. 7 hours. Jonathan froze. He hadn't expected a response, let alone one that carried that much weight behind it. Veronica shifted uncomfortably, her fingers gripping the armrest. Great, she muttered. As the plane taxied onto the runway, Sophie passed by, offering Shaq a quiet nod. And for the first time, Jonathan noticed it. The subtle recognition. The silent acknowledgement. Jonathan and Veronica were used to owning spaces, controlling the narrative, setting the tone. But something about this man, his quiet, unshakable presence, unsettled them. And the flight hadn't even taken off yet. The engines hummed as the plane ascended, but the real turbulence was brewing in row 3. Jonathan and Veronica whispered between themselves, making no effort to hide their irritation. "This is unbelievable," Jonathan muttered. "First class is meant for people like us." Veronica discreetly pulled out a silk handkerchief and wiped her arm where Shaq's sleeve had accidentally brushed against hers. She wrinkled her nose, whispering, "I feel suffocated." Shaq, still unreadable, didn't react. But he didn't have to. His very existence was a statement. Jonathan exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Some people just don't belong here." The moment the words left his mouth, Shaq finally turned. Fully this time. His dark eyes locked onto Jonathan's, and for the first time, Jonathan felt it. The weight of his presence. A presence that required no raised voice, no aggression, no effort, just being. His voice was calm, deliberate. "Say that again." Jonathan swallowed. For the first time in a long time, he felt small. His mind screamed at him to retaliate, to say something sharp, cutting, but his body knew better. The power had shifted. Veronica, sensing the growing tension, grabbed Jonathan's arm. "Let's just focus on the trip, John," she whispered. Across the aisle, Raymond Wolfe, a distinguished man in his early 50s, chuckled softly as he folded his newspaper. Jonathan clenched his jaw, his pride suffocating him. The flight was just beginning, and he had already lost. A few hours later, as the plane soared through the night sky, the intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge a very special guest on board today." Jonathan barely listened. His mind was still tangled in the humiliation of earlier. Then the captain continued, "Please join us in welcoming one of the most influential figures in modern aviation. It's an honor to have our CEO flying with us today." A murmur of curiosity spread through the cabin. Heads turned, passengers whispered. Sophie, now standing near row 3, smiled knowingly. And then, Jonathan saw it. The subtle shift in the energy around them. The politeness in Sophie's stance. The recognition in the passengers' glances. The way everyone was looking, not at him, but at the man beside him. Jonathan's stomach twisted. Veronica stiffened beside him. "Wait. What?" Across the aisle, Raymond Wolfe smirked, his blue eyes twinkling with amusement. He extended a hand toward Shaq. "Pleasure seeing you again, Mr. Simmons." Jonathan's breath caught. Shaquille. Big Shaq Simmons. Billionaire. Philanthropist. The CEO of Sky One Airlines. And they had just disrespected him. Veronica's fingers fumbled in her lap. Her throat tightened. We didn't mean..." Shaq raised a hand, silencing her. "No need." His voice was steady, controlled, unbothered. "You already said enough." Jonathan felt the fall before the plane even landed. Some lessons hit the hardest at 30,000 feet. And this was a fall without a parachute. The first-class cabin of Flight 172 was used to witnessing quiet disputes. Passengers requesting seat changes, subtle power struggles over overhead luggage space, or passive-aggressive complaints about service. But this was something different. It had started as a minor conflict, a wealthy, entitled couple displeased with their seating arrangements. But now, the air inside the cabin had shifted. Eyes were watching, ears were listening. And Jonathan Carter, a man used to controlling rooms, conversations, and outcomes, was beginning to realize he was losing control. Sophie's practiced, polite smile remained in place, but beneath the surface, there was iron in her spine. She had dealt with difficult passengers before, but never one so loudly arrogant. "We don't discriminate against passengers, Mr. Carter," she repeated evenly, her words crisp and professional. "If you'd prefer a different seat, you'll need to wait for the next available flight." Jonathan let out a short, humorless laugh. "You expect us to just sit here?" His voice oozed entitlement, loud enough to be heard, but just restrained enough to avoid making a full scene. He gestured toward Shaq with disdainful fingers, as if pointing out a broken fixture in an otherwise flawless luxury space. "While this takes up half the cabin?" For the first time, a hush fell over first class. A few murmurs, a subtle intake of breath from a woman across the aisle, a sharp glance from a man sipping his whiskey. Anticipation crackled in the air. All eyes flicked to Shaq. Would he react? Would he respond? Would he snap back at Jonathan's insult? But Shaq didn't react, not in the way Jonathan expected. If anything, his lips curled slightly, not into a smile, but into something far more dangerous. Amusement, a silent challenge, a look that said, "That's all you've got?" And then? He adjusted his position just slightly, shifting his massive frame, stretching out his legs, owning even more space without a word. His presence alone made the first-class cabin feel smaller. Jonathan felt it, and he hated it. Across the aisle, the crisp rustle of a newspaper being folded broke the silence. Raymond Wolfe, a distinguished man in his early 50s, lowered his paper and observed the scene with mild amusement. Dressed in a charcoal suit, his piercing blue eyes flicked between Jonathan and Shaq, his expression unreadable, but entertained. He had seen this before. Not on flights, perhaps, but in boardrooms, negotiations, power plays where one side didn't yet realize they'd already lost. Jonathan wasn't used to being ignored. He felt the heat of eyes on him, the weight of the moment turning against him. He had expected Shaq to shrink, to apologize, to move. Instead, the opposite happened. The cabin's silence, Shaq's nonchalance, Raymond's smirk. All of it stoked Jonathan's irritation like gasoline on a slow-burning fire. His ego demanded retaliation. So he leaned forward, voice dropping into a low, venomous whisper. "I'll have your job for this." Sophie didn't flinch. Instead, she met his gaze evenly, and Jonathan saw something in her expression that sent an uncomfortable chill down his spine. She wasn't scared. She wasn't intimidated. She had power, too. "Sir," she said calmly but firmly, "I'm afraid we're at full capacity. You have a choice. Take your seats or deboard." The words hung in the air like a final move in a game Jonathan hadn't realized he was losing. The subtle escalation wasn't lost on the cabin. Passengers who had previously been indifferent were now watching with quiet interest. Because this was no longer just a seating dispute. This was an exposure of power, of character, and of who truly belonged here. Veronica, sensing that the tide was turning against them, huffed dramatically and all but threw herself into her seat. She crossed her legs with deliberate force, her arms folding, her exaggerated sigh filling the cabin. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Jonathan, however, wasn't ready to let go. His fingers tightened around the armrest, knuckles whitening. Backing down in front of an audience, being forced into submission by an airline employee and an oversized stranger, was a bruise to his ego he couldn't tolerate. But with the eyes of the cabin on him, he had little choice. His jaw clenched, his pride screamed at him. But in the end, he lost. Jonathan lowered himself into his leather seat, begrudgingly, angrily, but definitively. And Shaq? Shaq didn't say a word, didn't gloat, didn't smirk. He just stretched his legs out a little more, his knee nearly brushing Jonathan's. An unspoken message, a silent reminder of who had won. And just like that, the power had shifted. Raymond smirked, folding his newspaper in half and settling back into his seat. This flight, it seemed, was going to be far more entertaining than he'd anticipated. The engines hummed louder as the plane began its slow taxi toward the runway. Jonathan sat rigid, his entire body tense, his thoughts burning with resentment. Veronica scrolled through her phone aggressively, as if trying to mentally escape the cabin. Shaq remained completely unfazed, his breathing steady, his eyes half-lidded as if he were already bored of the situation. But inside first class, the real turbulence had already begun. As the plane lifted into the sky, the true lesson of Flight 172 hadn't yet revealed itself. But it would. And when it did, Jonathan Carter and Veronica Hayes would realize that some falls don't need turbulence. They happen in silence, at 30,000 feet, where there's nowhere to run, and no parachute to break the fall. The engines roared as Flight 172 ascended into the sky, but inside the first-class cabin, another kind of pressure loomed. The tension between the passengers in row 3 remained thick, an unspoken war waged through glares, whispers, and calculated gestures. Jonathan and Veronica leaned toward each other, their voices hushed, but not enough to escape the ears of those nearby. Their irritation clung to every word, their distaste palpable. Veronica exhaled sharply, reaching into her designer handbag and pulling out a silk handkerchief. With a dramatic flourish, she wiped her arm where Shaq's sleeve had brushed against hers, her lips curled in exaggerated disgust. "I feel suffocated." Jonathan gave a curt nod, his voice dripping with quiet resentment. Unbelievable. Some people just don't belong here. The moment the words left his mouth, Shaq turned. Not fast, not aggressive, just a slow, deliberate movement, like a predator shifting its attention. His dark eyes locked onto Jonathan, unblinking, unreadable. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who rarely needed to repeat himself. "Say that again." Jonathan's breath hitched. The bravado he had so effortlessly displayed earlier faltered, the confidence in his posture betraying him. He suddenly became acutely aware of just how large the man beside him was, how his presence alone seemed to swallow up space. Jonathan had spent his life being the one who commanded a room, who made others uncomfortable with a single glare. Now, for the first time, he was on the receiving end, and he felt small. Veronica noticed the shift. Her fingers tightened around her purse strap as she quickly leaned in. "Let's just focus on the trip, John," she whispered, her voice lower now, careful. She wasn't used to seeing Jonathan hesitate, and that alone unsettled her. Across the aisle, Raymond watched with quiet amusement. He had seen men like Jonathan before, powerful in their own curated worlds but fragile when stripped of their carefully constructed advantages. He chuckled softly, shaking his head as he turned back to his newspaper. Jonathan shifted uncomfortably, gripping the armrest. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in a space where he expected to reign supreme. And yet, sitting beside this man, this immovable force, he realized something. For the first time in years, Jonathan Carter didn't feel like the most important person in the room. He felt insignificant. And that was a feeling he couldn't tolerate. But the flight had only just begun. The steady hum of the engines had lulled the first-class cabin into a state of mild relaxation. Some passengers sipped champagne, others scrolled through their devices or lazily flipped through glossy travel magazines. The tension from earlier had simmered down, but it still lingered in the air like the last wisps of a storm cloud. Jonathan sat rigid, his arms crossed, his expression set in a scowl. He barely touched the meal in front of him, too preoccupied with the sting of earlier humiliation. His fingers mindlessly swiped across his phone screen, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Veronica, still bristling, had resorted to silence, occasionally checking her reflection in her compact mirror, her mood soured by the unpleasant turn the flight had taken. Then, the intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge a very special guest on board today." A few heads lifted from their reclined positions, mild curiosity flickering across their faces. Jonathan barely paid attention, still brooding, his thumb lazily flicking across his phone. The voice over the speaker continued, the captain's tone shifting into one of reverence. "Please join us in welcoming one of the most influential figures in modern aviation. It's an honor to have our CEO flying with us today." A ripple of murmurs spread through the cabin. Passengers straightened, exchanged glances, some scanning the room in an attempt to spot the VIP in question. Even Raymond Wolfe lowered his newspaper, his eyebrows raising slightly. Jonathan's scrolling slowed. Veronica perked up, adjusting in her seat. Across the aisle, a businessman nudged his wife, whispering. Then, Sophie, the flight attendant who had earlier held her ground so firmly, reappeared. This time, her demeanor had completely transformed. She wore a bright, genuine smile, the kind reserved for dignitaries and royalty. And she wasn't looking at Jonathan. She was looking at Shaq. "Sir," Sophie said, her voice warm, respectful. "Would you like anything special before we land?" Jonathan's head jerked up so fast, his neck nearly snapped. His brows furrowed, confusion flashing across his face. "Wait. What?" Veronica blinked, her lips parting slightly. "Why are they—" Shaq, who had remained a silent, looming presence for most of the flight, finally leaned forward. He rested his forearms on the tray table, his fingers interlocking as he looked directly at Jonathan. His voice, deep and steady, carried an effortless authority that required no raising. "You didn't know?" He tilted his head slightly. "This is my airline." Jonathan's face drained of color. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Veronica sat frozen, her eyes darting between Shaq and Sophie, as if waiting for someone to confirm it was all a joke. But the way Sophie stood, hands clasped, waiting attentively, this wasn't a joke. Across the aisle, Raymond exhaled a soft laugh, shaking his head as he took in the priceless expression on Jonathan's face. The weight of realization settled on Jonathan's chest like an anchor. He had spent the entire flight complaining, belittling, and acting as if he owned the space, only to discover he had been sitting next to the man who actually did. Shaq didn't gloat. He didn't need to. His presence alone, his calm, unshaken demeanor, had already spoken volumes. Jonathan swallowed hard. For the first time in years, he was at a loss for words. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't the most powerful man in the room. The shift in the air was undeniable, and the landing was still ahead. Veronica forced an awkward laugh, though it came out brittle and uncertain. "You're joking." But the silence that followed crushed any hope that this was some cruel prank. Across the aisle, Raymond Wolfe folded his newspaper with precise, practiced movements, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. He turned toward Shaq with a knowing smirk, extending a hand. "Pleasure seeing you again, Mr. Simmons." Jonathan's world shifted beneath him. His throat went dry. His mind scrambled for some rational explanation, but there was none. Shaquille, Big Shaq Simmons. The name thundered inside his skull. Billionaire, philanthropist, CEO of Sky One Airlines, the very airline they were flying on. And they had just belittled him, dismissed him, treated him as if he were nothing. Veronica's fingers trembled slightly as she clutched the silk handkerchief in her lap. The weight of what they had done pressed down on her, suffocating. She had spent the entire flight sneering, complaining, making passive-aggressive comments, and now she felt the walls closing in. We didn't mean," she started, her voice shaky, grasping for some thread of redemption. But Shaq simply raised a hand, silencing her effortlessly. "No need," he said coolly, his voice smooth, controlled. "You already said enough." The simplicity of his words stung more than any outburst ever could. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He didn't need to. The authority in his tone, the quiet finality of it, made it clear. There was no undoing what had already been done. Jonathan's face burned with humiliation. His usual confidence, the arrogance that carried him through every boardroom, every exclusive event, every high society dinner, had vanished, leaving behind something he was entirely unfamiliar with: shame. For the first time in his life, he was not the most powerful person in the room, and everyone knew it. The air inside the first-class cabin had shifted. It was thick now, heavy with the unsaid. The low hum of the engines was the only sound, drowning out the deafening silence between Jonathan, Veronica, and the man they had so foolishly underestimated. Jonathan clenched his fists under the table, his palms slick with sweat. His entire life had been built on power plays, on knowing how to control a room, how to be the loudest voice without raising it. But now, in this moment, he had no moves left. Veronica shifted uncomfortably, her fingers tightening around the armrest as if anchoring herself. She wanted to say something, anything, but words felt meaningless now. Shaq, on the other hand, was at complete ease. He leaned back in his seat, stretching out, unbothered, unaffected. Jonathan had spent the past few hours seeing Shaq as lesser, as someone who didn't belong in first class. And yet, it was Jonathan who felt small now. Across the aisle, Raymond Wolfe sipped his champagne, a knowing glint in his eye. This was better than any in-flight entertainment Sky One could have offered. Jonathan swallowed hard, his mind spinning. Damage control. He needed damage control. He cleared his throat, forcing a tight smile. "Mr. Simmons, if I had known..." Shaq tilted his head slightly, eyes narrowing just enough to make Jonathan shut up before he could even finish the sentence. If I had known? Jonathan realized too late how bad it sounded. If he had known what? That Shaq wasn't just some random man in a hoodie? That he was somebody? That he was powerful, wealthy, influential? Because the truth was, nothing should have changed. Whether Shaq was a billionaire or not, Jonathan's behavior had been the same. His real thoughts, his real judgment of people, had already been exposed. Shaq let the silence stretch. Then, finally, he spoke. You fly often, Jonathan? His voice was calm, but there was an undeniable edge beneath it. Jonathan nodded quickly, eager to grasp onto anything that might make this less uncomfortable. Yes, of course. I practically live on planes. Shaq exhaled a quiet chuckle. I'm sure you do. He let his words hang, the weight of them pressing into Jonathan's already fragile composure. Jonathan felt his pulse hammering. Every time Shaq spoke, it was like being under a microscope. Like every flaw, every ounce of arrogance was being exposed under an unforgiving light. Shaq finally shifted, looking out the window as the sky stretched endlessly before them. Funny thing about flying, he said, almost to himself. No matter how much money you have, no matter how important you think you are once you're up here. He tapped the glass. The sky doesn't care. The altitude doesn't care. Jonathan swallowed, his throat tight. He knew. He knew. This was more than just casual conversation. Shaq turned back to him, his expression unreadable. Some people forget that. Veronica exhaled sharply, closing her eyes as if wishing she could disappear. The plane had never felt smaller. Jonathan shifted in his seat, desperate to break free from the weight pressing down on him. He reached for his drink, his fingers unsteady, and took a hurried sip. But even the smooth burn of expensive whiskey couldn't settle the unease in his chest. He had walked onto this plane believing he was untouchable, that his wealth, his name, his power made him superior, that he was the kind of man who dictated how things went. But in the span of a few hours, everything had changed. He had mocked a man without knowing his worth. He had sneered at someone who had built the very airline he was flying on. He had exposed himself in a way he never had before, and now there was no undoing it. No apology would fix it. No money could erase it. Shaq wasn't a man who needed validation, and he certainly wasn't someone who would accept a forced, half-hearted attempt at redemption. He had already moved on. That, perhaps, was the worst part of it all. Jonathan and Veronica were insignificant to him, and that realization stung more than anything. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning our descent shortly. Flight attendants, please prepare for landing. Jonathan let out a slow breath, relief washing over him. It was almost over. He just needed to get off this plane. As the flight attendants moved through the cabin, preparing for landing, Shaq reached for his phone, checking a few emails as if nothing had happened. For him, this flight was just another routine trip. For Jonathan, it was a reckoning. He sat in silence as the plane began its slow descent, his mind reeling, his ego shattered. For the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to fall, and the landing had never felt so far away. The first-class cabin, once buzzing with quiet chatter and polite indulgence, had now turned into a silent stage where Jonathan Carter and Veronica Hayes found themselves in the harshest spotlight of their lives. The tension was no longer a subtle undercurrent. It was thick, suffocating, inescapable. Sophie returned, her usual warm professionalism now laced with something colder. In her hand was an official document, neatly folded. She approached Jonathan and Veronica's seats, her posture unshaken, her expression unreadable. Jonathan's eyes narrowed as he saw the paper. His irritation, already simmering on the edge of explosion, deepened. What's that? Shaq, who had been sitting in silent dominance, finally moved. He stretched slightly, as if giving himself time to enjoy the moment before unfolding the document. His fingers traced the edges of the paper, slow, deliberate. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but there was an undeniable weight to it, final and unwavering. I don't tolerate discrimination on my flights. He held out the paper to Jonathan. Jonathan snatched it with a scoff, his arrogance flaring up in one last desperate attempt to reassert himself. But as his eyes scanned the contents, the color drained from his face. Effective immediately, Jonathan Carter and Veronica Hayes are permanently banned from all Sky One Airlines flights. His grip on the document tightened. A slow, seething anger boiled inside him, but beneath it, fear. "This is ridiculous," he hissed, his voice sharp, but not as loud as he intended. His bravado was cracking, and he knew it. "You can't." Shaq barely reacted. He simply raised an eyebrow, his expression one of absolute control. "I can." He leaned back, exuding effortless authority. "And I did." The simplicity of his words hit harder than any outburst ever could. He wasn't explaining himself. He wasn't arguing. He was just stating a fact. Jonathan's chest tightened, his mind scrambling for a way out of this. He wasn't used to being powerless, to having decisions made for him. His entire life had been built around controlling the narrative, bending situations to his will. But now, he had no leverage, no power, nothing. Veronica, still gripping the armrest as if trying to ground herself, reached out, her fingers latching onto Jonathan's wrist. Her nails dug in slightly, a silent plea for him to stop, to let go, to accept what was happening. "John," she whispered, her voice suddenly small, defeated. Let's just go." Her words weren't just about leaving the plane, they were about acceptance. The realization hit her harder than turbulence. Their status, their money, their privilege. It meant nothing here. Not against a man who had built his own empire, who had earned respect instead of buying it. For the first time, Veronica saw the stark difference between them and Shaq. They had influence, but he had power. Real power. The kind that didn't need validation, and there was no winning against that. Jonathan, however, wasn't ready to accept defeat. Not yet. He leaned forward, his voice low, desperate. "Look, we got off on the wrong foot. Maybe we can sort this out." His tone was different now, measured, controlled. The same tone he used when closing million-dollar deals, when persuading board members, when making people believe in him. He thought he could still turn this around. Shaq remained still. "Sort what out?" Jonathan hesitated. He wasn't used to being questioned so directly, without the usual politeness or pretense. He forced a chuckle, trying to regain some ground. "Come on, let's be reasonable. This whole thing got out of hand. Maybe we had a misunderstanding." Shaq's eyes didn't waver. "A misunderstanding?" Jonathan nodded quickly, seizing the opening. "Exactly. We didn't mean any offense. You know how travel can be. Long flights, stress. People say things they don't mean." Shaq exhaled through his nose, amused at the sheer audacity. "You meant every word," he said simply. "The only thing that's changed is that you found out who I am." Jonathan's jaw clenched. He had nothing to say to that because it was true. He had been fine with his behavior when he thought Shaq was just some random passenger. He had felt comfortable dismissing, insulting, and treating him as less than. The only thing that had changed was his realization of Shaq's worth. Shaq leaned in slightly, his voice lower now, carrying absolute authority. "I built this airline, Jonathan. Every policy, every decision, every standard, I set them. And one thing I don't tolerate? People like you thinking they can decide who belongs where." Jonathan had nothing left to argue. For the first time, words failed him. Across the aisle, Raymond Wolfe observed the exchange with quiet satisfaction. He had witnessed many power struggles in his years, corporate takeovers, boardroom betrayals, financial warfare. But this was something far more personal. Jonathan Carter had built his reputation on dominance, but he had just learned the hardest lesson of all. True power doesn't need to flex. It just exists. And the entire first-class cabin knew it. Murmurs spread as passengers discreetly watched the scene unfold. They had seen Jonathan and Veronica's arrogance at the beginning of the flight. They had witnessed their entitlement, their dismissiveness. And now, they were watching the fall. Jonathan wasn't just losing this battle. He was losing his image. Veronica could feel the weight of every stare. The way people were pretending not to listen while doing exactly that. The way they looked at Shaq with admiration, and at her and Jonathan with quiet judgment. Her face burned. She needed to get off this plane. Sophie, sensing the need to move things along, cleared her throat. "We'll be landing shortly. Mr. Carter, Ms. Hayes, your belongings will be waiting for you at the terminal." Jonathan's eyes snapped to her. "Excuse me?" Sophie remained professional, her hands clasped neatly in front of her. "Your bags were removed from the private transport service. You'll need to arrange your own transportation from the airport." Veronica inhaled sharply. You canceled our car?" Shaq merely glanced at his watch, unfazed. "I don't think my airline should be catering to people who don't respect the passengers on it." It was the final blow. Not only were they banned, not only had they been publicly humiliated, but now they were about to be stranded at the airport with no VIP treatment, no priority service, nothing. They had walked onto this flight believing they were above everyone else. Now, they were no one. As the plane finally touched down and taxied to the gate, Jonathan and Veronica sat in stiff silence. They could feel the stares, the unspoken judgment. And the worst part? No one even cared enough to gloat. Shaq wasn't smirking. Raymond wasn't mocking them. Sophie wasn't reveling in their downfall. They had already moved on. Jonathan and Veronica were nothing more than a brief inconvenience. As the first-class passengers began gathering their things, Veronica pulled down her sunglasses, hoping to shield herself from the reality of what had just happened. Jonathan grabbed his briefcase with an iron grip, his entire body tense. They stepped into the aisle, heads low, and made their way toward the exit. The first-class cabin parted for them, clearing a path, not out of respect, but out of dismissal. They weren't important anymore. They weren't powerful anymore. They had lost. And worst of all, Shaq hadn't even needed to try. As they disappeared down the jet bridge, Shaq leaned back in his seat, stretching slightly, completely at ease. Raymond chuckled, shaking his head. "Never gets old." Shaq smiled slightly. "No, it doesn't." And with that, the chapter on Jonathan Carter and Veronica Hayes was closed. For good. The captain's voice crackled through the intercom, signaling the final descent. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be landing shortly. Please fasten your seatbelts and prepare for arrival." Shaq barely reacted. He remained as he had been for most of the flight. Calm, unbothered, a force of quiet authority. He gazed out the window, watching the clouds thin as the city lights below grew sharper, brighter. Raymond Wolfe, still lounging in his seat, exhaled a quiet chuckle. He folded his newspaper with slow amusement. That was entertaining. Shaq smirked slightly. "I get that a lot." Jonathan sat stiffly beside him, his jaw clenched, his fingers gripping the armrest like a vice. His usual polished composure had cracked, leaving behind something raw. Anger, embarrassment, the sharp sting of exposed arrogance. For the first time in a long time, Jonathan Carter had nothing to say. Veronica, however, was not as stubborn. She exhaled shakily, the weight of the past few hours pressing down on her. Her manicured fingers twisted the silk handkerchief in her lap, and for once, she didn't seem concerned about appearances. She hesitated, inhaled deeply, then turned toward Shaq. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Her voice was quiet, sincere, almost fragile. "I shouldn't have judged you." Shaq didn't react immediately. He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, after a beat, he gave a slight nod. Not overly gracious, not dismissive, just an acknowledgement. A silent understanding that growth begins with recognition. Veronica released a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Jonathan, however, remained silent. He refused to look at either of them. His pride was a fortress, and though the walls had cracked, he wasn't ready to let them fall. Not yet. As the plane descended further, the runway below came into focus. The cabin shifted with subtle turbulence, but the real turbulence had already settled. Passengers gathered their things, adjusting their seats, preparing to leave. The tension from earlier had faded, leaving in its place an undeniable shift in the air, one that Jonathan and Veronica would carry long after this flight. As the wheels touched down, Shaq stretched slightly, relaxed as ever. The flight attendants moved swiftly, preparing the cabin for disembarkation. Sophie passed by, shooting Shaq a small, knowing smile. Jonathan unbuckled his seatbelt with sharp, agitated movements. He wanted off this plane. He wanted distance from this humiliation, from the quiet judgment of strangers, from the man who had effortlessly dismantled his ego. But no matter how fast he left, he couldn't outrun the truth. Jonathan Carter was not as powerful as he thought he was. As the first-class passengers filed out, Veronica walked lighter than before. She wasn't entirely free of her past self, not yet, but something had shifted. Jonathan, on the other hand, stormed off. His posture was stiff, his steps sharp, his pride still clinging desperately to the illusion that he was in control. Shaq remained seated, watching them leave with quiet amusement. He knew men like Jonathan. He had met them in boardrooms, at exclusive galas, in high-stakes negotiations. Some learned, others never did. And then there were those, like Veronica, who at least tried. As the last of the passengers exited, Shaq finally stood. His presence still commanded attention, but now there was nothing left to challenge him. There never had been. At the gate, a sharply dressed chauffeur stood waiting beside a sleek black luxury car. The man nodded respectfully as he opened the door. Shaq stepped inside, the leather seat cool beneath him. Before the door closed, he glanced back at the terminal, at the countless travelers moving through, some with purpose, some without. He smiled. Some lessons were best learned in books. Some were learned through experience. But the most valuable ones, the ones that truly changed people, those were learned at 30,000 feet. Power isn't about wealth. Respect isn't about status. Character is revealed when no one's watching, or when the whole world is. Jonathan Carter thought money made him untouchable, but at 30,000 feet, he learned a brutal truth. Real power doesn't need to announce itself. Now ask yourself, how would you have acted in his place? Would you have judged too quickly, spoken too soon, assumed too much? Or would you have recognized true power before it was too late? Next time you step onto a plane, a boardroom, or any room, remember, the most powerful person isn't always the loudest. Share this story with someone who needs the reminder.